I am thrilled to be able to call him a friend and now a guest of the Rich Eisen Show here on the 32nd anniversary of Pete Rose being banned for life in baseball is the great Keith Olbermann. How are you, KO?
Well, I just had to knock Dan over, Rich. I mean, he was getting in my way, and I had to roll him over. And my dad was in the audience. Sorry, I couldn't resist.
Not a problem. No, so DP is the Ray Fosse of this analogy right there?
Well, he would not say that, no.
How you doing, KO? How you doing?
I've been banned enough times, so I think my part of the analogy works, doesn't it? It never occurred to me before. It was like, why am I sympathetic to Pete Rose? Oh!
So, tell everyone where you were 32 years ago today, Keith
Covering
Olbermann.
Bart Giamatti's announcement of the suspension banishment of Pete Rose by happenstance. I was working in Los Angeles. I was the sports director at Channel 2, and it was summer, nothing going on, vacation. I was home, leaving Friday morning. It was a Friday to go back to L.A., and Thursday night, the story began to break that this press conference was going to take place. Threw the plans into reverse, went with the local crew from Channel 2 here in New York, and was at that press conference. And, you know, I mean, it's a historical moment. We see it as like a flash. There's 2 points of importance. One, that story had been building up for a year. I have a vision of myself standing outside spring training with the Angels in 1989, holding up Sports Illustrated with the beginning of the end of Pete Rose. That was March. So every day that summer until this time of the year, it was Pete Rose this, Pete Rose that, 4 years after he broke the hit record. And this was, this would be the equivalent of, banning Ohtani in 4 years or any other huge baseball figure. And the second part of it was, Bart Giamatti, and I said it on the air that day, and I still haven't gotten over this, was the most alive I ever saw anybody anywhere the day that he banned Pete Rose, and a week later he dropped dead of a massive coronary. It's still just the most forceful, righteous indignation. He was vengeance as justice. And the most alive person I've ever seen do anything, and he was gone a week later. An extraordinary week.
So, what was it like in that room, Keith, 32 years ago today?
There was Bart Giamatti, and the rest of us were just kind of watching this orchestra conducted by a man by himself. I mean, he had the whole thing prepared, and it was clear from his phrasing, based on what we're hearing out of Cincinnati, that he had somehow convinced Pete that this was a reviewable suspension and a temporary thing and maybe a year or something, and then in fact he had slipped the noose around Pete's neck and did what we have seen since, which was a lifetime ban without really ever calling it that. But it was so dramatic, and rarely do stories in any line of life in my 40-plus years of covering this stuff, stories that have such a long buildup. I mean, there were rumors of this in 88. I first heard something about Pete Rose and gambling in 1980 out of the memorabilia business. And it took all that time to build up, and yet this was like, I can't compare this to anything else of that kind of long buildup. This was lightning. This was a series of lightning strikes, only the man standing at the podium was throwing the lightning. That was what it was like.
Keith Olbermann here on the Rich Eisen Show, 32nd anniversary of the Bart Giamatti press conference announcing Pete Rose being banned for life. KO was at that press conference. So the sense was at the time that Pete would have a chance to come back, or
no. I think the sense was that Pete thought he was going to get a chance to come back, and a lot of the ill will between Pete and baseball, I think, really originated with the idea that they I don't know if they didn't read the documents close enough, or Pete didn't understand them, or what happened. But Giamatti was going for a permanent ineligible ban. I mean, his last words were, "The subject of Pete Rose is closed." And I think the from later in the same day when they put those questions to Pete, he was like, No, it's going to be reviewed in a couple of weeks. And that's the whole, he believed he was signing some sort of admission in exchange for leniency. And I guess the leniency was he was only suspended for one lifetime rather than for 25. But Giamatti was clearly furious at that news conference and suppressing rage and it contributed to the nature of the forcefulness, and many people thought it contributed to Bart's death too, because the entirety of his commissionership was essentially consumed by dealing with the Rose scandal as it built and built and built. And that was, if you tie this into the idea that's also sort of lost to history, Bart Giamatti was considered to be the man most likely to save baseball from itself. He was a president of Yale, a scholar, and a baseball addict, and a Red Sox fan when that meant you can endure losing. He wrote poetry about baseball, and who was probably the most overqualified baseball executive of all time. And he was coming in, he was going to clean things up, and the first step was, Pete Rose thinks he's going to sue me? Go ahead. Try it. And that was his attitude. He was going to say the same thing and had said the same things to owners. And we haven't had a commissioner in sports like that. There have been some good ones like Adam Silver and a few others who have done okay, but commissioners are toadies who are management employees. Fay Vincent would have banned like 16 owners if he'd had, Giamatti would have done it. Vincent tried. Bart Giamatti would have banned 16 owners if he'd had 20 years in the commissionership. So there's that second element to it as well, besides Pete.
So then I guess that might answer my next question, Keith Olbermann, which is if Giamatti had not passed away a week later, you know how stances soften over time, right? So do you think the fact that Giamatti passed, and then there are people who are close to him who do believe that the Rose scenario and situation led to his heart giving way, that if he had lived, that maybe Rose might not be banned for life today?
No, I don't. I think that regardless of what the consequences were, obviously Bart Giamatti died because he was a chain smoker, and the other things that brought stress or pressure to him could have been interchangeable with things that did or did not happen elsewhere in his life. You can. I'm recreating a sense of this must have contributed to his stress. Who knows? But I will say this: I don't think that there would have been much of a different path for Pete under a long-term Giamatti commissionership, because again, there had been in that year many threats from the Rose side, like don't you dare try to. He's the most popular man in baseball, which might have been true. He's the most famous player in baseball. He broke that bastard Ty Cobb's record. I think Giamatti was believed that the entire power structure and the rules that he most believed in, as in no gambling, certainly no gambling on your own team, passive aggressively or otherwise. I think he believed Rose was not only violating them, but challenging them and challenging essentially the rule of baseball law. And nobody was righteous like Bart Giamatti. It put a lot of people off. But it endeared him to other people because he was that hard on himself and people that he liked as well as people he didn't like. But it was a personal struggle between these two men, and Bart Giamatti died thinking he had banished Pete Rose for life, and I think it would have stayed that way.
And what about Rose's demeanor towards all of this? I had mentioned earlier, and I wonder what you think about it, Keith, that had Rose taken the approach towards gambling and made himself the face of the scourge of gambling, similar to what Mantle did about alcohol and how it can tear away at your career and your family, and it's not for everyone, and don't do it. Had Rose taken that approach, do you think he would still be banned today on that front?
I'm really conflicted about the answer to that, because you could just as easily ask the theoretical, if Pete had laid low for a long time and then came out as the face of baseball-friendly gambling, which the leagues have now endorsed, maybe he would have been reinstored that way. The attitude towards this entire topic has done a 180 in the last 20 years, maybe longer, really. It started with the acceptance of fantasy baseball as kind of a low-grade gambling form, which I often indulged in, as you may remember.
Yes, I do.
But it's such a strange what's moral and what's immoral. It changes every few years in many different areas. I think Pete went through periods of time in which he was really remorseful and was showing an understanding of what happened and was trying to atone. And I thought he should have been left off the hook. And then, oh, by the way, the stuff with underage girls came out, and that was the end of it. But they did, the commissioner's office had to sign off on Pete Rose going back to Fox for baseball postseason coverage. So he did, in fact, get back into the game, and there was a path for him to go further back into the game and maybe even have that ineligibility lifted in some formal way. It had been, to my mind, it had been lifted informally. Pete Rose was not, you can't be banned from baseball and be on the frickin' postgame show to the World Series. So it's like the Joe Jackson ban. We're going to celebrate Shoeless Joe Jackson every year now in Dyersville, Iowa, but he's still officially banned, and nobody should do what he did. Brought to you by DraftKings. It's kind of a mixed message now.
Keith Olbermann here on the Rich Eisen Show. What about the sense of the fact that Cooperstown is a museum as much as it is a shrine to the greats, and placing on a plaque the whole story as best you can fit on a plaque and put Pete in for what he did on the field? What about the sense of that?
Well,
Keith?
You're now asking to do something subtle in one of the least subtle places in the world, which is the Baseball Hall of Fame. If you wanted to do that, there are means to do it tomorrow. Stratify the Hall of Fame into echelons. The all-time immortals, or whatever you want to call them, which would be Ruth and Aaron and Josh Gibson and 20 people or whatever. And then there'd be everybody else who reached certain statistical plateaus and other people who got voted in, and infamous people who, ruined their own lives and careers. And you could have essentially the Hall of Fame members who were bad guys. If you want to have Barry Bonds and Pete Rose over in one section with Shoeless Joe Jackson and Eddie Seacott and George Hall and Jim Devlin from the 1877 Louisville team that threw the pennant that year, you could do that too. But this is, this requires a lot. I will point out, as is often, I think, mentioned about Pete, the best part of the Baseball Hall of Fame is the behind-the-scenes tour that you can usually get if you know somebody. Mm-hmm. And in a room downstairs next to the 37-degree photo vault is the uniform vault. And I forget how many Pete Rose uniforms are in the Hall of Fame right now, but I believe it was a dozen. And that, by the way, the uniforms is how we knew something was wrong, because when you could not collect baseball uniforms because teams did not sell them or distribute them in the late 70s and early 80s, you could always find a game-used Pete Rose uniform. And the story was he needed so much money for something, gambling was the rumor, that he used to buy the uniforms after he wore them in a game or two and would sell 20 or 30 uniforms a year. And the joke was, collector goes to the dealer and says, I want a Pete Rose game-used uniform. And the guy goes, Cincinnati, Montreal, or Philadelphia? And the fan goes, Cincinnati. He goes, home or away? Like, home. 60s vest style or Big Red Machine pullover? Pullover, please. Okay, what size? And that's 1979, 1980. So we sort of saw this coming. So that circles back to the idea that Pete Rose is in the Hall of Fame, as Shoeless Joe Jackson is in baseball's marketing strategy. It's such a complicated subject, which would be made a lot easier if they just said, hey, this is a complicated subject. The rules bend now and again. We're going with this one this year, and we'll see what happens next year.
A few minutes left here with Keith Olbermann on the Rich Eisen Show. I would be remiss if I did not finish up with this, because you referenced him to try, and I imagine, place in perspective for those who might be of a little younger than us, Keith, to try and place in perspective what banning Rose felt like back in the day 32 years ago. You invoked the name of Shohei Ohtani. Mm-hmm. I would be remiss if I did not give you the floor to try and place in perspective of what we are seeing from him this year, Keith Olbermann.
All right. Well, this is not a criticism of his work nor a diminishing of what he has done. Okay. It is almost unprecedented for the time that we're living in which the key is specialization. He is a generalist, and this is an extraordinary thing. I will point out there was a 19th century pitcher who one year led the league in earned run average, and the next year was the batting champion. So these things have happened in history with two-way players before. I would say that I would like to see a little bit larger body of work. Not that there's anything that suggests this isn't going to continue, but I'd like to make sure that it's more than just a couple of seasons before it's He's the greatest player of all time. Well, no, Babe Ruth is the greatest player of all time because he did this. He had a Hall of Fame pitching career and then a Hall of Fame record-setting hitting career. It's early, and my biggest problem with baseball right now, and it's true of all sports, is whatever just happened, if you phrase it correctly, it's a record. That's the most homers and wins by one guy on a Thursday in the middle of August. And people take this dead seriously, and people get credited for pointing these things out. And I just the greatest baseball pitching season of all time was by Harry Krause of the 1909 Philadelphia A's. Mm-hmm. And nobody knows who the hell he is. His first 10 starts in 1909, he threw 8 shutouts, 10 complete games. We don't know how many earned runs he gave up, but it may have been as few as 2. And those were his first 10 starts. Then he hurt his arm, and the next year he was pitching for Portland to the Pacific Coast League. And I'm not saying that's going to happen to Shohei Ohtani. I'm just saying, please give me a little bit more context before I assess him amongst the panoply of all-time greats. Because I heard this all year, all spring, from friends of mine like Gary Cohen about how Jacob deGrom was the greatest pitcher of all time. I was like, can we just get to the All-Star break without his arm falling off? And nobody will do this now, no matter what the sport is. It's whenever I turn on coverage of the NBA or NFL, it's the same thing. It's like, he's the greatest player of all time. He came into the league 3 weeks ago, and I'm only being slightly hyperbolic about this. Let's just assess something at the end of the season. It's extraordinary. It's something out of, in terms of comps, you have to go to the 19th century to find anybody who was this good at both things, even for this period of time, because Ruth, of course, was a pitcher, small transition period, about a year and a half, then basically just a hitter. So it's remarkable, and it's Hall of Fame trajectory, but it's really early.
All right, so that's the long-term view. What about, let's just place it in 2021 box, is it most valuable? Is he the MVP of the AL?
By almost every definition of it, other than the fact that the Angels are once again not in a pennant race, and if they were, maybe Trout would be injured for the playoffs, which would be poor Trout's luck.
Right.
Other than the contending quality that you like to see in an MVP, yeah, I think it should be unanimous at this point, for the simple reason that, once again, when you say who's the greatest baseball player of all time, at least in American and National League context, we don't have a full picture for the players who did things similar to this in the Negro Leagues. But in the American League, National League context, what exactly, who do you compare to Babe Ruth, who was, in his time, perhaps the best left-handed pitcher of the game, and then became a hitter, the equivalent of whom now would have to hit something like 150 homers in a season. So when there is a guy who could finish at 50 homers and double-digit wins as a pitcher, just the 50 home runs might get him the award. But if you throw that added little, frisson of excitement that is, oh yeah, he pitches and wins. And I speak as somebody who was utterly skeptical of this when he came into the American League. Mm-hmm. Yes, I would say that he's if he were to sort of go home for the year or not play again or whatever for the season, I think still, yeah, this performance is most valuable player because it covers candidates and wipes out most of the other hitting candidates, and it holds its own against most of the other pitching candidates.
KO, this was awesome, as I had hoped and expected, and greatly appreciate. And of course, I know you were into rotisserie baseball and fantasy baseball. I'll just let everybody know. When I was the intern for the CBS Evening News in the summer of 1994, Eric Sorensen, who was the executive producer of the Evening News, one of the first tasks I did was to make copies of the one report from the weekly report that was mailed to him for a fantasy or rotisserie baseball league. And as I copied that for Eric, I noticed the name on it of one of the members of the league, Keith Olbermann. And I immediately asked Eric, how do I get in touch with him? Can I send a tape to him? And his end of the summer present to me, or at least kudos to me, was to actually send a tape to you, Keith. And that's how I first got in touch with you, ever. Correct, with one insulting detail that you got wrong. Of course. As usual, I, sir,
yes, sir,
was the commissioner of that league. I ran that league. So then, and
Yes.
How did I get copies? Oh, wait a minute. I opened his mail for him and saw that it came from you. Now
I used to compile the stats,
yes,
put them out weekly when this was still a novel idea, when you couldn't just buy stats from a stat provider, and I would fax them. I would fax them from my home near ESPN headquarters, world headquarters in Bristol, Connecticut. Fax them and then put a copy in the mail in case somebody needed a hard copy. We did the standings. Read up to the minute, state-of-the-art stats once a week.
KO, thanks.
Sorensen was in that league, and in fact, we used to have the auction was bi-coastal because most of these guys in this league were with me in Los Angeles in local sports, and we would have a bi-coastal auction where some of the owners would get together at an LA TV station, and Sorensen and me and the 1 year Mike Tirico was in it. We would get together on a Saturday morning in a boardroom at CBS TV. And we would have this thing. We'd get on a speakerphone and conduct this auction with all these guys. And yes, and then Eric called me up one day and goes, "Hey, KO, I've got somebody for you. Maybe you want to look at this tape." Eric was great to me. Eric gave me all sorts of money. Eric bought me 2 or 3 houses.
I'm still waiting on that, but he hooked me up with you, and I still speak with him, and I'm thrilled that I still can get you.
He used to make really bad trades with me. Another reason I liked him very much.
Take care of yourself, KO. Thank you for the call.
You too, Rich.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. That's the one and only Keith Olbermann right there on The Rich Eisen Show. Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.